40 days of Lent are, of course, meant to correlate in some way of remembrance with Jesus' 40 days in the wilderness. 40 was a convenience that meant to indicate a long time. Whether they were ticking off these days on the calendar or not, I seriously doubt it. But it does mean that it was a long enough, difficult time for it to be a trial for Jesus. It did not pass quickly. It was difficult. Now, oftentimes, the temptations in the wilderness are viewed as kind of on the surface of what they appear to be. Jesus is hungry, so Satan offers him bread. And then Satan says, well, I'll take you up to the very pinnacle of the temple, and if you throw yourself off, God will take care of you and you won't be harmed. And then subsequently, he takes him to the top of a mountain so Jesus can survey all of the dominion of the world. And if you will obey me and worship me, I will give you all of that power. Well, I think that oftentimes we can let the story go at that and say, well, wasn't that good that Jesus resisted that? But there's a far more powerful temptation in this story and a far more powerful intervention of the power of evil to try to subvert the plan of God. Because what this story really says is Satan tried to convince Jesus not to be Son of God incarnate. He tried to convince Jesus not to be human. Instead, I will offer you bread of any kind that you want. You will not have to suffer any pangs of hunger or thirst. You will have everything in abundance. Interestingly enough, we have a world that is wrought with famine even to this day. And that is part of the human condition. As regrettable as it is, we have children in our own state who go hungry every night. And so, certainly, Jesus is being tempted to give up that part of the human condition. And he refuses. He will suffer hunger. And on the cross, if you remember, he says, I thirst. And then we have Jesus who is tempted to throw himself off the pinnacle of the temple. And Satan says, but of course the angels would come and rescue you. Have no fear. Why does Jesus refuse? Because that would be to refuse to participate in human physical vulnerability. And what is the ultimate of that physical vulnerability? Well, we know illness. We know all sorts of calamities and disasters that befall us in our physical being. And Jesus has a chance to escape it all. Because the angels will protect him, will they not? The deceiver tries to convince Jesus that he does not need to suffer physically. And so what do we learn later on in his story? That he suffers the ultimate physical death. At that time, the most cruel death of all, death upon a cross. So Jesus refuses again not to take on his human role. We believe that Jesus is fully God and fully human. And then finally, Satan says, look at all that you could have. Look at the dominion. Look at the power you can have if only you will worship me. And the deceiver, once again, tries to draw Jesus away from his incarnate being, his identification with, and his immersion in the human condition, and to say, you do not have to be subjected to any power. Forget those Romans. If you worship me, you will be more powerful yet than they. Even though they have an empire, and even though your country is part of that empire, you will have all the power that you need. And so Jesus refuses again and subjects himself to the human condition of vulnerability. Vulnerability to principalities and powers. And it was the principalities and powers of the Roman Empire and of the Jewish temple that conspired to put Jesus to death. He refused to be allowed an escape clause. He refused to allow himself to avoid being in part of our human condition. And it was the grace of God that God chose to immerse God's self into the very fabric of our existence, so that we might truly know the grace of God, because the God who has walked with us knows all of the foils and temptations and difficulties that we have, whether it be hunger, or whether it be physical problems, or whether ultimately it be subjection to powers and principalities. In this day and age, we have all of that going on around the world. We look at Libya in terms of power. We look at other places in the world, but Libya has been on the news of late. We look at Japan for natural disasters that probably have killed upwards of 1,000 people and destroyed homes and villages. And then we look at powers and principalities, and we look at hunger throughout the world. All of these things are still part of the human condition. And the mystery of God is that God is with us in all of that struggle. The wilderness experience was not just 40 days in some place in Palestine. The wilderness experience is now. We are on the wilderness journey. When we respond to the hunger in the world, we refuse to avoid that part of the human struggle. When we say to ourselves, yes, the good also gets sick. The good also have physical problems. And we must tend to them and support them, even though we know that our physicality makes us powerless before some of these diseases. And then finally, we have to admit that there are times, even in our own government, that powers and principalities seem to have more of a concern for retaining power than they do of exercising compassion. We are still in the wilderness, brothers and sisters, and we trust again that God is with us, for our brother Jesus walks before us. You may not always see him, but once in a while you will see his face. In fact, as I look around, I see his face now. Amen.